The mountain road had no exit, 2 lanes, no shoulder. Douglas firs pressing in from both sides like they'd been waiting, and somewhere ahead a black SUV was angling across both lanes. Slow, deliberate, patient, not blocking the road by accident, blocking it on purpose. In the mirror, the second vehicle had already sealed the rear, a driver who checked tires for a living, a CEO worth more than most countries. A mountain road with no signal and no witnesses. 3 weeks earlier, he'd worn a funeral suit to a job interview. Nobody had asked why. Nobody ever asked the quiet ones why. They should have, because the man behind that wheel had spent 14 years bringing people home alive from places that don't exist on any map. And he had not once, not ever, left someone behind. The SUV didn't move, neither did. 3 weeks earlier, he'd worn the same suit to a job interview, charcoal gray. Single button. He'd pressed it himself the night before. Standing in the kitchen of his apartment at 11 o'clock with the iron his wife had bought at a Target in Tacoma 6 years ago. The suit had been to one funeral, his wife's, 3 years back. He hadn't worn it since because there hadn't been occasion to. And because every time he opened the closet and saw it hanging there, clean and dark and quiet, he thought about the way she'd straightened his tie that last morning before everything became a before. But Sloan had printed the application. That was the thing. Cole hadn't done it himself. He'd looked at the listing, thought about it for 2 days, decided it was probably not the right fit, and then his daughter had walked into the kitchen with a printed copy of the form and a pen, and set both on the table in front of him without a word. Sloan was 20, studying mechanical engineering at the University of Washington. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn quiet, and she had inherited from both of them the ability to communicate enormous amounts of information without saying anything at all. The printed form on the table said, "You are going to do this." So he did. The Sterling Meridian building was glass and steel, and the kind of clean that costs money to maintain. Cole sat in the marble-floored foyer with 6 other candidates and watched the room the way he'd been trained to watch rooms. Not at the center, at the edges, where the exits were, where the sight lines crossed, where the things that mattered were always trying not to be seen. The other candidates had money in their presentation, tailored lapels. The practiced ease of men who had spent time learning how to appear unbothered. One of them caught Cole's eye and gave him the kind of nod that professional people give each other in waiting rooms. Cole nodded back and returned to watching the exits. When the assistant led him to the vehicle bay, Cole was told to perform a standard pickup demonstration. Open the rear door, acknowledge the principal, confirm the route. He didn't open the door. He walked the length of the vehicle first, slowly, the way you walk a perimeter when it matters whether you walk it correctly. He crouched at the rear passenger wheel, straightened, moved to the front left, tilted his head near the wheel well, ran 2 fingers along the seam of the rear bumper where it met the body panel. Reed Calloway stood 6 feet away with his arms crossed. Reed had 22 years in federal law enforcement and another 8 in private executive protection. He had the face of a man who had seen this kind of performance before and had not been impressed by it then either. Cole wasn't performing. The rear right tire was running 17 pounds per square inch below safe operating threshold. He said so, plainly. No inflation, no apology for slowing things down. Just the number and what it meant and the fact that he would not move a vehicle with a passenger until it was corrected. Reed's expression shifted, very slightly, in the direction of someone who has just recalibrated. He didn't let Cole see him do it. A technician confirmed the reading 4 minutes later. Audrey Sterling appeared in the bay doorway while they were still dealing with the tire. She was carrying coffee. She had the posture of someone who runs meetings rather than waits for them. She studied Cole the way she studied anomalies in a financial report, looking for the pattern that would tell her what she was actually looking at. She asked whether he always slowed down schedules like this. He told her he only did it when the schedule was moving faster than the safety margin could sustain. No charm. No pivot toward a compliment designed to soften the directness. Just the answer. Audrey looked at him for 3 seconds, looked at the tire, looked back at him. She hired him before the day was out. The first week taught Cole more about Audrey Sterling's world than the job description had implied. Her schedule changed 3 times before noon every day. Not because of chaos, because of control. She moved her own calendar the way a chess player moves pieces. Not to reach a destination, but to create a position that gave her the advantage she needed when the important move came. Most people around her didn't notice she was doing it. Cole noticed. Everyone who approached the vehicle at curb pickup had something they wanted. A briefing delivered where no one could interrupt. A request made while she was in motion and couldn't redirect her attention. A question framed as small talk that was actually a survey of her mood. Cole catalogued all of it from the front seat without remark. He kept the interior temperature consistent. She'd mentioned her preference once, on the second day. 68 degrees. She hadn't repeated it. Cole had kept it at 68 degrees every day since. On Thursday of the first week, he called Sloan from the parking structure below the Sterling Meridian Tower. The old sedan he'd driven to the interview was tucked into a corner of B2, where a structural pillar gave him a visual on both entrance ramps. He told Sloan the salary would cover the back rent, with something left over for fall semester. He told her to stop checking the bank app every morning, because it was not a productive habit. He could hear her trying not to sound relieved. He hated that she'd learned to do that. Learned to sand down her worry so he wouldn't see it. That was his fault. He knew it was his fault. He'd spent too many years coming home to a household that had learned to manage without him. And the managing had been so thorough and so quiet that by the time he understood what it had cost everyone, the cost had already been paid. Audrey passed B2 on her way to a coffee meeting that afternoon. She heard his voice from across the structure, not the words, just the register of it. A man speaking with care, measuring each sentence for what it might do to the person on the other end. She filed it away and kept walking. What she noticed over those first 10 days was what Cole didn't do. He didn't ask about holiday bonuses. Didn't repeat what he heard in the vehicle to other staff. Didn't close the gap between driver and passenger with small talk designed to make himself memorable. Didn't angle for additional responsibility before it was offered. He positioned himself exactly where he needed to be, near enough to act, far enough not to crowd. With the reliability of something calibrated rather than merely trained, Reed's team maintained proximity through protocol. Cole maintained his through judgment. The difference was visible if you'd spent enough time watching people who were paid to pretend compared to people who simply knew. He noted that Audrey's protection detail changed formation without notifying her, that the vehicle bay entry log was signed manually and not cross-referenced against the electronic key card system. That schedule details moved through channels too wide for the information they carried. He noted all of it, said nothing. His job was to drive. Warren Sterling came to the estate twice in the first 10 days. He was 68 years old, and he carried himself the way certain men carry themselves when they've spent decades in rooms where their name opened doors. Former state senator, Audrey's father's younger brother, the kind of uncle who had been indispensable during the transition period after her father died and who had, in the years since, remained in proximity to the company with the patient persistence of someone who considered proximity itself a form of influence. Cole watched him at a Friday evening reception outside the East Terrace. Warren moved through the space with ease, paused at exactly the right moments, asked questions that sounded like curiosity but were actually pressure applied so gently that the person being pressed rarely felt it until later. He approached Audrey twice. The first time, she was in a group. He joined the edge of it, casual, patient. The second time, she was alone for 40 seconds near the bar. He materialized at her shoulder like he'd been standing there the whole time. Cole couldn't hear the exchange from where he was positioned, but he watched Audrey's posture, watched the way her shoulders moved, the way she angled her body by 3 degrees. Not away, but not open either. A boundary communicated through geometry rather than words, and Warren smiled at whatever she said. The smile of a man who had heard no before and was not concerned by it. Cole filed it away. He had no reason to act on it. Warren Sterling was Audrey's uncle, a fixture in her world that predated Cole's arrival by decades. But the smile bothered him, not because it was unfriendly, because it was too patient. The grey sedan appeared for the first time on a Tuesday. Cole noticed it because of where it wasn't moving. Traffic on Westlake was crawling. Everything crawled at that hour. But most vehicles in slow traffic do what slow traffic does. They inch forward. They tap brakes. They fill gaps when gaps appear. They behave like people who are trying to get somewhere. The grey sedan wasn't trying to get anywhere. It was maintaining distance. Constant following distance in variable traffic is not a driving habit. It's a surveillance technique. Cole had been taught the difference when he was 23 years old in a context that had nothing to do with Seattle or limousines or CEOs, and the knowledge had not gone anywhere in the years since. Once was noise. He filed it and said nothing. The sedan appeared again on Thursday. Different route. Waterfront approach to the Meridian building. Cole caught it in the mirror at the second stoplight. Same profile behind the headrest. Same patient distance. Same absence of urgency. Twice was correlation. He filed it and said nothing. Friday evening. After the board dinner, he pulled out of the parking structure onto the main avenue, and there it was. Again gray four-door. Hairline scratch on the passenger side front bumper. Different position on the street. Same driver silhouette. 3 times was a pattern worth treating as a fact. Cole took the long way back to the estate, not because he was lost, because he needed to see what the sedan did when the route changed. It followed, not close, not obviously, the way water follows the path of least resistance, present, continuous. Indifferent to whether you'd noticed it yet. When he delivered Audrey to the estate, he sat in the vehicle bay for 7 minutes after she went inside and wrote down everything he had. Gray sedan, partial plate, estimated driver height from headrest position, 3 locations, 3 different times of day. The fact that the vehicle had matched a route change he hadn't communicated to anyone outside the car. That last detail was the one that mattered. He gave the written summary to Reed Calloway the next morning. Reed read it with the expression of a man professionally required not to dismiss his subordinates, but who had already done so internally. He said high-profile executives often attracted surveillance from journalists, research firms, and competitor intelligence operations. He said none of those constituted an actionable threat. He thanked Cole for the diligence. Cole said, "The route change," Reed said. "I heard you." Cole said, "The vehicle appeared at the secondary exit. I changed that route inside the car." No advance notice, Reed said, noted. He did not look at Cole when he said it. 2 days later, Cole changed the route to Audrey's 9 o'clock without any advance notice, taking a variation that bypassed the usual approach by 6 blocks. He chose the variation at the last possible moment, didn't enter it into the navigation system, didn't mention it to anyone. The gray sedan was at the secondary exit when they arrived. Cole didn't tell Audrey immediately. He needed to understand what he was dealing with before he put a name to it. Names had weight. Names changed the way people behaved. And the way Audrey Sterling behaved in the next 48 hours was going to matter more than almost anything else. He spent that night in the vehicle bay. He had a magnetic detection tool he'd purchased that afternoon from a commercial security supplier. Nothing exotic, the kind of equipment available to anyone with a reason to want it and the internet to find it. He worked his way under the limousine methodically, starting at the front, moving aft. 22 minutes in, he found it small, weatherproofed, mounted above the rear axle housing with adhesion mounts that needed a specific cure time to set properly. The device was transmitting on a frequency outside the estate's fleet monitoring system. Not part of the installed hardware. Someone had added it. Cole photographed it in place without touching it first. Then he looked at the cure time on the adhesion compound. The compound needed 12 hours to set fully, which meant the device had been placed during a specific window. Cole went back through his mental log of the past week. When had the vehicle been in the bay and the bay been accessible? He cross-referenced it, one he already knew, 3 nights ago, between 11:47 and 11:59. The bay camera had lost its signal for exactly 12 minutes. Cole knew it had lost signal because he'd checked the log when he filed his report about the sedan. Standard procedure. If you're building a surveillance picture, you account for the gaps. That 12-minute gap had registered as minor at the time. Camera technical issues happened, but the cure time put the device placement inside that exact 12-minute window, which meant someone had killed the camera to place the tracking device. And the only person with remote override access to the bay's camera relay was Wade Rennick. Cole sat on the concrete floor of the vehicle bay for a long moment. Not because he was unsure, he was very sure. He was sitting because he was thinking through the next step with the care it deserved. Rennick had transferred to the estate's security team from the Portland office 4 weeks ago. He was now serving as deputy director, well-regarded, clean record, nothing in his profile that would explain this, which meant the explanation wasn't in his profile, which meant someone had reached him from outside, which meant this went somewhere else entirely. Cole stood up, took one more photograph, left the device in place. He didn't go to Reed this time, he went to Audrey. She was in her study when he knocked. Past 10 o'clock. She answered the door with the measured patience of a woman who had learned that people who knocked at this hour rarely brought good news. She looked at him. Then at his face, she said, "Come in." He told her about the sedan, all 3 incidents, the route change that the driver should not have known about. He told her about the tracking device, the photograph, the cure time, the 12-minute camera gap. He did not tell her about Rennick, not yet. He had a photograph and a timeline correlation. That was not yet evidence of a person. It was evidence of a window. Audrey listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked for the photograph. He handed her his phone. She looked at the image the way she looked at financial reports, methodically. Looking for the pattern underneath the pattern, she said, "You need to check the full undercarriage. Clean sweep. In the morning, before the vehicle moves," he said. "I already did. That's the only device." She looked at him. He said, "I needed to know the full picture before I came to you." Another pause. She said, "Reed?" Cole said, "Not yet." She understood why. He could see it in the way her expression settled. Not into agreement necessarily, but into the recognition that he'd made the correct call. She had spent enough years in rooms where information was a currency to understand that you didn't spend it until you knew its full value. She said, "What do you need?" he said. "I need you to approve a restricted schedule protocol, starting tomorrow. Your movements shared only with me, Reed, and one administrative contact," she said. "You're asking me to cut Rennick out," he said. "I'm asking you to narrow the channel." She studied him, the way she'd studied him in the vehicle bay on the day of the interview, looking for the pattern underneath the surface. Then she said, "Done." He found out about the phone call on a Thursday. Not because Audrey told him. Because Sloan called him first. He was in the parking structure below the Meridian building, eating a sandwich he'd bought from the deli on 4th Avenue. When his phone rang, Sloan, 2 in the afternoon. She had a lab on Thursday afternoons. She didn't call during lab. He answered before the second ring. She said, "Dad," he said. "Talk to me." She said someone had called her 40 minutes ago, unknown number. The voice had been calm, measured, and it had told her things about her schedule that she didn't understand how a stranger would know. Her Thursday lab, her Tuesday morning seminar, the coffee shop where she studied on Wednesday evenings between 5 and 7. Her voice was steady. She'd been raised by a man who treated steadiness as a form of respect, and she'd learned it the same way she'd learned most things, by watching him do it and deciding it was worth learning. But Cole could hear what was underneath the steady. He said, "Are you in the lab right now?" She said, "I left." "I'm in the student center," he said. "Good. Stay there. Go somewhere with people," she said. "Dad." "Who?" He said, "I'm going to explain everything. Not right now. Right now I need you in a public space and I need you to call me every 30 minutes. Pause. She said, "Okay." He said, "I love you." She said, "I know." She hung up. Cole sat in the parking structure for a moment. The sandwich was still in his hand. He put it down. He went through the information methodically. The way he'd been trained to go through information when it was personal, and the training was the only thing standing between him and a reaction he couldn't take back. Her Thursday lab, her Tuesday seminar, her Wednesday coffee shop. That level of detail did not come from watching. You couldn't get a coffee shop time slot from following someone for a few days. That level of detail came from a feed, a continuous information source, something transmitting her movements in real time or close to it. Sloan hadn't told anyone connected to the Sterling estate anything about her schedule. But Audrey had called Sloan twice in the past 3 weeks. Short calls. A courtesy call after Cole's first week, and a brief check-in when Cole had mentioned Sloan's name in passing. Those calls had been made on Audrey's phone. Cole looked at what that meant, looked at it plainly, without the part of his brain that wanted to move past the implication, because the implication was significant and significant meant time. And time was the one thing he currently did not have. Someone was monitoring Audrey's phone, not the vehicle. The phone, and through the phone they had found Sloan. He called Reed, filed a formal report through the state's emergency protocol, called the non-emergency line to establish a record. He arranged, through a contact outside the estate's network entirely, a former colleague who now ran private transportation security in the Pacific Northwest, For someone to check on Sloane without alarming her, vary her routes. Standard precautions, framed as routine. Sloane asked no questions that framing couldn't satisfy. Cole did not move her, did not suggest she come to the estate, did not put her inside any perimeter connected to this situation. He thought about what he'd told Audrey. Fear translates into consolidation. Consolidation creates a smaller perimeter. A smaller perimeter is something an adversary can control. He would not put his daughter inside a perimeter that someone else had already mapped. That evening, after he had settled Audrey back at the estate and confirmed Sloane's check-in for the 4th time, the call came 9:17 p.m. None number, he answered. Didn't speak first, waited. The voice was calm, unhurried. The voice of someone who believed they were offering a transaction rather than making a threat. It told him, drive Friday's route without deviation. Don't alert anyone, and his daughter would never have reason to know anything had happened. Cole listened to the full message, then he played it back. Then he sat in his car in the parking lot of his apartment building and gave himself exactly 90 seconds to feel what needed to be felt. The anger, the cold focus that came after the anger. The thing underneath the focus that had no clean name but that he had learned, over years and in contexts that had nothing to do with Seattle or limousines, was not fear exactly. It was the recognition that this had become a different kind of situation. He had been in different kinds of situations before. He knew what to do in them. He called, Reed. He reported the call. He documented every word in writing and filed the documentation through 2 separate channels. He confirmed Sloane's location. He called her. He listened to her voice for 40 seconds while she talked about a study group. She said, Dad, you sound weird, he said. Long day, she said. Go to sleep, he said. Working on it. After she hung up, Cole sat with the phone in his hand for a long moment. He thought about Friday's route. He thought about the device under the axle housing, the sedan in 3 locations, the 12-minute camera gap. The phone monitoring application he now suspected was sitting on Audrey's device, transmitting in the background on a continuous feed. The way the threatening voice had known Sloane's Wednesday coffee shop time as precisely as if it had been reading it off a calendar. He thought about Warren Sterling, about the smile that was too patient, about a man who had been in proximity to this company for 14 years and who had apparently decided that proximity was no longer enough. He thought about Reed Calloway's expression when Cole had first mentioned the secondary exit, the calculated quality of it. Reed had not been surprised, he had been careful, and there was a difference between those 2 things that Cole hadn't resolved yet. He pulled out the notepad he kept in the center console. He wrote down the timeline of everything he could document, everything with a timestamp, everything with a third-party confirmation or a physical artifact. Evidence. That was the word. He was building evidence. The way you build it when you know the days ahead are going to require something more than instinct and more than training, and more than anything a job description had ever prepared him for. Friday was in 36 hours. Cole started the car, drove home, set the alarm for 5, lay down in the dark apartment that still had his wife's handwriting on the grocery list magnet on the refrigerator. He'd never moved it, couldn't explain exactly why. Just that it was there, and every time he opened the refrigerator he saw her handwriting, and it was still, 3 years later, a form of company. He looked at the ceiling. He thought, whoever this is, they used Sloane to get to me. They used her because they assumed a father would flinch, that the threat would make him manageable. They had made a significant miscalculation, not because Cole didn't love his daughter, because he loved her in the specific way of a man who had learned, at great cost, that the best protection you can give someone is not to make them part of the problem. He would not flinch. He would not deviate. He would not make Sloane a variable in someone else's equation. What he would do was drive Audrey Sterling to her Friday appointment, and when whatever was waiting for them on that road showed itself, and it would show itself because plans like this always did, he would handle it the way he had handled every other situation that had asked more of him than his title suggested he should have. He closed his eyes. The apartment was quiet. Outside, Seattle settled into itself, the sound of rain starting somewhere over the sound, the hiss of tires on wet pavement on the street below, the ordinary noise of a city that didn't know what was moving through it. Cole slept. He would need to. Friday came in gray, the kind of gray that settles over Seattle in October like it has nowhere else to be. Low clouds, wet streets, The sound of rain that had stopped 2 hours ago still dripping from the parking structure's concrete overhangs in slow, irregular intervals. Cole was in the vehicle bay at 6:15. He swept the limousine again. Full undercarriage, every seam, every wheel well. The tracking device he'd found 4 days ago was still in evidence storage with Reed, photographed and logged. But he checked anyway, because checking was not a sign of doubt. Checking was a sign of discipline. And discipline was the thing that kept you alive in the gap between what you expected and what actually happened. Clean, he checked the tire pressure. All 4. He checked the fuel, he checked the brake response in the empty bay, pulling forward 6 feet and stopping twice. He checked the side mirrors, the rear camera, the angle of the driver's seat, and the temperature setting on the rear climate control, 68 degrees. He drove to the estate's main entrance at 7:10. The convoy was assembled in the motor court. 2 vehicles ahead of the limousine, 1 behind. The advance vehicle carried 2 protection team members Cole recognized. The trailing vehicle was under Wade Rennick's direct command. Reed stood at the edge of the motor court with his tablet, checking roster, confirming positions. Cole pulled alongside him. He said, "Who authorized the trailing formation?" Reed said, "Standard protocol for the Harborview signing." Cole said, "Rennick's in the trail vehicle." Reed looked at him. "He's deputy director. That's his position." Cole said nothing more. He pulled the limousine forward to the designated pickup point and put it in park. He watched the advance vehicle in his mirror. The driver was a man named Decker, 12 years with the detail. Reed's pick for the lead position 3 years running. Cole had no particular reason to look at Decker twice, except that Decker had arrived 7 minutes after the rest of the team, which was unusual, which might mean nothing. Cole filed it the way he filed everything, without conclusion, without a story attached to it yet. Just the data point, clean and waiting for context to arrive. Audrey came through the main entrance at 7:28. 2 minutes early. She had a flat document case under her arm and moved with the efficiency of a woman who treated punctuality as a form of respect for other people's time. She wore charcoal, a silk blouse, hair back. The kind of put together that looked effortless because she'd had 20 years of practice making it look that way. She got in the rear. Cole closed the door behind her. He got in the front. He pulled out of the motor court at 7:31, the advance vehicle moving ahead, the trail vehicle falling into position behind. For the first 20 minutes, nothing happened. Which was the problem? Because Cole had been in enough situations where nothing happened right before everything happened to understand that nothing was not the same as safe. Nothing was a condition, a waiting, a held breath. He kept his eyes moving. Mirror, road, mirror, left side, road, mirror. The advance vehicle was running point correctly, staying ahead by exactly the right distance. The radio channel was open and quiet, no chatter, which was normal for this route at this hour. At the 40-minute mark, they passed the Cascade Bridge interchange and began the long curve north toward the sound. Cole's radio clicked. Decker's voice came through flat and certain. Unit 1, there was an incident flag at the primary checkpoint, rerouting, and the advance vehicle turned left, off the agreed route, not a gentle adjustment, a definitive turn. The kind that commits you to a new direction before the question can be asked. The kind a driver makes when he already knows where he's going. Cole's hand stayed on the wheel. His eyes went to the mirror. The trailing vehicle was still behind them. Still at the same distance. He reached for the radio, pressed the call button, said calmly, "Unit 1, confirm the incident nature, static, not interference, not weather-related signal degradation." The frequency was being compressed. Someone was pushing noise into the channel to make it unusable without cutting it entirely. A technical distinction that most people would never know mattered. Cole knew it mattered. He said without changing his register, "Audrey, get down and stay down." Right now, she was already looking at him. She'd heard something in the radio static that she didn't have a name for, but that had told her something was wrong. She said, "What's?" He said now. She went down behind the seat, and then Cole saw it. Ahead, where the highway curved through the ridge cut, a black SUV had moved out of a maintenance pull-off and was angling slowly across both lanes. Not fast, deliberate, giving the limousine enough time to see it, to slow, to comply. In his mirror, a second SUV had moved up close behind them. The trailing vehicle, Rennick's vehicle, had fallen back, creating space, creating room for the vehicle that was now sitting on their rear bumper like it had always been there, boxed, front sealed. Rear sealed, Cole had 4 car lengths of stopping distance between the limousine's hood and the SUV blocking the road ahead. He used 3 of them, and then he cut the wheel left and drove into the gap. There was no gap on any commercial map, not on any navigation system, not on any route that a professional driver with a GPS and good intentions would have found. There was a drainage channel maintenance access road, half concealed behind a concrete barrier, marked with a reflective post that most people would have taken for a utility marker. Cole had found it in a maintenance survey document he'd downloaded from the county infrastructure database 3 days earlier. He'd cross-referenced it against satellite imagery at 11 o'clock Thursday night in his kitchen with the kettle running and his wife's grocery list in his peripheral vision. He had not entered it into any navigation system. He had memorized it. The access road was a single lane of compacted gravel, rain-soaked and rutted, running between 2 drainage berms into the tree line north of the highway. The concrete channel markers at the entrance were spaced at a width that would scrape both sides of a standard SUV if the driver tried to follow without knowing exactly what clearance they had. Cole knew what clearance they had. He drove it the way you drive a decision you've already made, committed, precise. Not fast enough to lose control on the wet gravel, fast enough that the distance between them and the highway was measured in seconds. In the back seat, Audrey didn't say anything. Not a question, not a protest. Not the kind of sharp intake of breath that might have been understandable from a woman who had been pulled down behind a seat, driven off a major highway, and fed into a gravel corridor through the forest while 2 unidentified vehicles sat somewhere behind them. She stayed down, she trusted him. And Cole felt that. Felt the weight of it in a way that had nothing to do with professional obligation and everything to do with the understanding that trust extended under these conditions was not a small thing. It was the largest thing in the vehicle, larger than the engine, larger than whatever was behind them, larger than the plan he was building one decision at a time in the 3 seconds between each turn. He drove for 4 minutes on the access road. Then he turned onto a secondary maintenance path that branched left from the main channel track. This one was grass and gravel both, narrower, completely invisible from the primary road. He'd found it on the same survey document. A notation, a dotted line on a county infrastructure map that most people would have scrolled past. He stopped the vehicle behind a natural break in the tree line, cut the engine, turned off the commercial GPS. Reached into the driver's door pocket and pulled out a satellite emergency beacon, small, flat, registered to a contact completely outside the estate's network, a former colleague in private security, Pacific Northwest, the kind of person who didn't ask questions because he'd spent years in contexts where questions were slower than understanding. Cole activated the beacon. Then he looked at it for 1 second and made a decision. He switched it off, pocketed the transmitter, took the beacon itself and got out of the vehicle, walked 20 feet north along the tree line, placed the beacon on a flat rock near the base of a cedar, switched it back on, then he walked back to the car. Audrey was sitting up now. She looked at him through the window. He got back in. She said, "What did you just do?" he said. "Misdirection. If they're tracking the beacon signal, they'll go north. We're going west." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "How far west?" he said. 3 miles. There's an old ranger checkpoint, decommissioned." And she said, "And then?" He said, "We worked the problem." He started the engine and pulled back onto the secondary path, moving west through the tree cover, keeping his speed low enough that the tire marks in the wet grass would be minimal. Not invisible, but minimal, and minimal was enough for now. Behind them, the beacon sat on its cedar root and transmitted dutifully into the October sky, pointing anyone who was looking in exactly the wrong direction. The checkpoint was exactly where the county survey document said it would be. 1 room, cinder block. A door that opened with the second key on a maintenance ring Cole had sourced through channels he preferred not to specify. A folding table. 2 plastic chairs. A diesel generator in an external housing that started on the 3rd pull. Fluorescent light. The kind of yellow-white that made everything look like what it was, ma'am frames on the walls. Old ones. Topographic detail you only found in paper records now. Cascade foothills, drainage basins, the thin blue lines of seasonal creeks that had different names in summer than in winter. Cole checked Audrey's hands first. She said, "I'm fine." He checked anyway. No abrasions, no impact damage. She'd gone down cleanly when he'd told her to. He said, "Are you hurt anywhere else?" She said, "Cole." He said, "Audrey." She said, "I'm fine." He let it go. He set the contents of his door pocket on the folding table, the backup radio unit, a compact first aid kit, his notepad, the pen clipped to it. He wrote down both license plates from the SUVs. He'd caught them in the mirror during the box formation. 2 seconds, maybe 3. But 2 seconds was enough if you'd spent years training yourself to read plates under worse conditions than this. He wrote down the call time of the anonymous threat, the timestamp on the tracking device's adhesion cure, the frequency compression he'd identified on the convoy radio. He wrote down Decker's 7-minute late arrival. Audrey watched him write. She said, "You're building a case file," he said. "I'm building a record," she said. "There's a difference," he said. "A case file is for after. A record is for now." She was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled the second plastic chair out from under the table, sat down across from him, and folded her hands on the tabletop. She said, "Tell me what you know." So he told her. All of it, in order. The sedan and the 3 locations, the tracking device and the cure time and the 12-minute camera gap. The phone call about Sloan and what the level of detail in that call implied about a monitoring application on Audrey's personal device. The convoy's radio compression. The way Decker had turned without hesitation. Without the micro pause of a driver who had just received unexpected information and was processing it. The decisiveness of someone who already knew where he was going. When he finished, Audrey was still, the generator hummed. Outside, the wind moved through the firs with a sound like someone turning pages. She said, "My phone." He said, "May I?" She handed it to him. He checked the temperature. Warm. Warmer than a device in sleep mode should be. He ran a manual diagnostic, the kind that required knowing where to look rather than knowing which app to open. He found the monitoring application in 40 seconds, small, deeply embedded, authenticating through a certificate that belonged to the estate's internal protection team security system. He looked at the timestamp on the certificate. 5 weeks ago, he showed her. She looked at the date. He watched her do the math. He watched her arrive at the same place he'd arrived at when he'd first considered the possibility. She said, "Rennick transferred from Portland 4 weeks ago. He'd only been here 1 week when this was installed." Cole said, "He was here, but he hadn't been provisioned with senior administrative credentials yet." "That certificate requires someone at the executive access level," she said. "Which means Rennick didn't install this." Cole said, "Who had senior administrative credentials and access to your phone 5 weeks ago?" Audrey was quiet. He waited. She said, "Warren." Not a question, a recognition. The kind that arrives not as a surprise, but as the last piece of a picture you've been avoiding completing because the completed version is worse than the incomplete one. She said, "He was at the estate 5 weeks ago. Sunday dinner. His chief of staff was with him. I gave Warren my phone to show him a photograph from the Vancouver Coastal Property meeting. He handed it to his chief of staff to look at a route map we'd been discussing." Cole said, "How long did the chief of staff have it?" She said, 4 minutes. "Maybe 5, Cole said. "That's enough." She looked at him. The fluorescent light made the situation look like what it was, not a misunderstanding, not a security failure from negligence, a deliberate, coordinated act from inside her own family. He watched her absorb it. She didn't fall apart. He hadn't expected her to, but he watched something rearrange itself in her expression. The specific shift of a person who has just had a long-held assumption removed from underneath them and is discovering what they're capable of standing on without it. She said, "The board vote," he said. "Tell me," she told him. "The 48-hour emergency authorization clause in the company charter. If the CEO was unreachable and a quorum of the board agreed it was necessary, proxy votes could be activated and business could proceed without her." Warren had been building that quorum for 6 weeks, collecting commitments from board members she hadn't personally reached, scheduling confirmation calls during hours she was known to be unavailable. The acquisition of Sterling Meridian's logistics division, an investment fund with a layered ownership structure, a sale price below internal valuation by a margin too large to be explained by standard discount modeling. Audrey had found the anomalies herself, had begun building a private evidence file before saying a word to anyone. She laid all of it out, not with panic, with the methodical precision of a woman who treated even devastating information as a problem to be structured rather than a catastrophe to be survived. She spoke in sequence, event by event, number by number. the way she would have laid out a hostile acquisition analysis for a room full of attorneys. Cole listened without interrupting. He asked one question. At exactly the right moment, when she paused to draw breath between the acquisition structure and the timeline of the proxy commitments, he said, "What happens to Warren if the vote passes and you reappear?" she said. "He controls enough of the board narrative to raise questions about my stability. A CEO who disappeared for 48 hours without explanation, who left her protection detail voluntarily, who was found in an abandoned forest checkpoint with her driver." She paused. "The instability question doesn't require proof. It requires repetition," Cole said. "He doesn't need you gone permanently," she said. "He just needs the vote to pass, and me to look unreliable for long enough that the decision can't be undone." Cole looked at his notepad, at the name he'd written at the top, Decker. 7 minutes late, he said. "The route changed this morning." "Who authorized it inside the convoy briefing?" she said. "Reed proposed the original approach. Rennick overrode it at the 40-minute mark before departure. Said he'd received updated traffic intelligence." Cole wrote that down. He said, "Reed proposed the safe route. Rennick changed it with 20 minutes notice." "And Decker followed Rennick's version without question," she said. "Decker reports to Rennick." Cole set the pen down. He thought about Reed Calloway's expression on the morning Cole had reported the sedan. The careful quality of it. The response that had looked like dismissal on the surface, but hadn't quite been dismissal underneath. He picked up the backup radio unit. It was a short-range encrypted device, separate from the estate's main communication infrastructure. He'd carried it in his door pocket for 3 weeks. A habit so old he'd stopped thinking of it as unusual. You always had a secondary channel. You always had something that existed outside the primary network, because primary networks failed, were intercepted, were compromised by people who knew how primary networks worked. He keyed in the frequency, said, "Calloway, this is Cole. If you're on this channel, respond with the cascade phrase. Silence, 10 seconds. Then Reed's voice came through, compressed and low. The cascade phrase was a 6-word sequence Cole had established with Reed on the first day of the job. A procedural detail. A challenge-response protocol. The kind of thing you set up not because you expect to need it, but because setting it up costs nothing and not having it costs everything." Reed said all 6 words in the correct order. Cole said, "Where are you?" Reed said, "External location. I've been locked out of the control room." Remote access commands through Rennick's credentials, issued from a guest terminal Rennick logged as a vendor check, Cole said. "The 3 team members from the original convoy formation," Reed said, "dispatched to a fabricated incident location 20 minutes before departure. I didn't authorize it. The dispatch order carried my credentials. Someone cloned them," Cole said. "The incident report," Reed said. "Rennick filed it 11 minutes after the convoy broke formation. States that you isolated Audrey by exploiting her trust. That your background in special operations represents an undisclosed capability that should have flagged during hiring. The report recommends the board treat the situation as an active abduction until evidence proves otherwise." A pause. "It went to Warren Sterling's office directly," Audrey said quietly. "Of course it did." The generator hummed between them. Then Reed said, "Cole, I need to tell you something." Cole waited. Reed said, "I've known about Rennick for 4 weeks." The room went very still. Reed said, "I found an anomaly in the Bay access log 5 weeks ago. Rennick's credential appeared during a window I couldn't account for. I started tracking it, building the documentation, not just against Rennick, but against whoever was above him. Because Rennick doesn't run an operation at this scale alone. He doesn't have the connections or the capital. I needed the full chain before I moved," Cole said. "So you let me bring you the tracking device," Reed said. "I needed independent documentation that I hadn't touched. Evidence I hadn't built myself." Cole said, "And you said nothing to me," Reed said. "I said nothing to anyone." The line was quiet. Said, "Next time, tell me." Reed said, "Yes, just that one word. Not defensive, not explanatory. The acknowledgement of a professional who understood exactly what had just been said and accepted the weight of it." Audrey let out a breath. Cole said to Reed, "What do you have that we can use today?" Reed said. 4 weeks of documentation. Rennick's Bay access log with timestamps. Camera footage from the 12-minute blackout window, pulled from a legacy backup archive Rennick didn't know existed. The personal reassignment order that emptied the original convoy formation. "Wire transfer records," Cole said. Wire transfers to Rennick, Reed said. 3 payments over 6 weeks. From a corporate consulting firm registered in Oregon. I traced the registration back 2 layers. The firm's sole recorded client is a fund vehicle. The fund vehicle connects to Warren Sterling's personal holding structure. Audrey was looking at the map frames on the wall. She wasn't seeing them, Cole said. We need Cal Briggs, Reed said. I know where the Cascade District Station is. Cole said, find a way to transmit everything that doesn't touch anything inside the estate's network. You have 2 hours, Reed said. I'll find a way. Cole set the radio on the table. They were in the checkpoint room for 90 minutes. Cole spent 40 of those minutes going through the topographic maps on the wall, planning the route from the checkpoint to Briggs's station. 3 options. 2 that required a functioning vehicle on a maintained road. 1 that required the maintenance shed he'd noticed 200 meters south of the checkpoint when they'd arrived. He'd noticed it on the way in. He noticed most things on the way into any space. Old habit. The kind that had kept him and others alive in contexts he didn't describe to employers, because the description was classified and also because the description was not relevant to most jobs. It was relevant now. He went to check the shed while Audrey worked, and she worked. That was the thing about Audrey Sterling that Cole had understood, maybe on the first day, but certainly by the end of the first week. She did not stop, not because she was incapable of it, because stopping was for her a form of surrender to the conditions rather than a response to them. She worked the way water works around an obstacle, not dramatically, not with force, but with the continuous, patient intelligence of something that has decided it is going to get where it's going, regardless of what's in the way. By the time Cole returned from the maintenance shed with the keys to a county-licensed maintenance pickup that had a quarter tank of gas and all-terrain tires, Audrey had reconstructed the full timeline of Warren's acquisition plan from memory. She had borrowed his notepad. She had filled 4 pages. He looked at the pages, at the structure of what she'd written, sequenced, attributed, with notations in the margin where the evidence was solid and different notations where it was inferential and needed corroboration. He said, "You did that from memory," she said. "I've been looking at these numbers for 6 weeks. I know what's there," he said. "We need June Hartwell," she said. "I know. Do you have a way to reach her that doesn't go through the estate system?" he said. "Briggs does?" She looked at him. "You trust the county sheriff," he said. "I helped coordinate a search and rescue operation in these hills 2 years ago. Briggs gave me his direct line and told me certain situations called for a person rather than a department." Audrey was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "This qualifies." He said, "Yes," she said. "Cole," he said. "Yeah," she said. "Why didn't you drive away when you had the chance?" On that road, the vehicle was running. There were moments where leaving would have been defensible. He didn't answer immediately. The question deserved something real, not something quick. He said, "You were in my car." She waited, because she could tell he wasn't finished. He said, "That means something. It's not in any job description. It's not in any contract. But when a person trusts you with where they're going and how they get there, the moment your responsibility ends is not written on a paycheck." She looked at him across the folding table in the generator light. She said, "I have structured every professional relationship I've had for 20 years around knowing exactly what I'm paying for, what it costs and what it's worth and where the line is between the two." She paused. "I don't have a framework for this," he said. "You don't need one right now," she said. "I always need a framework," he said. "You needed to get down when I said get down, you did. That's enough." Something shifted in her expression. The way something shifts when a person has just been told something true in a form they didn't expect it to arrive in. She said, "That's a very small framework," he said. "It's the right size for this road." He stood, picked up the radio and the notepad, and looked at the map frames one last time. Then he said, "Let's go find Briggs." They left the checkpoint at 2:40 in the afternoon county maintenance pickup. Cole driving, Audrey in the passenger seat because the truck had no back seat, and also because there was something clarifying about a situation that stripped away all the usual architecture of how things were supposed to look. She held the 4-page notepad on her knee the whole way. He drove the Forest Service access route. Gravel over packed earth, a seasonal crossing with 2 inches of water from last night's rain. An uphill grade that leveled onto a ridge road connecting 3 miles north to the county highway that ran past Briggs's Mountain District Station. They were 6 minutes from the station when the truck's standard county comms radio picked up a cross-channel burst. Cole caught 2 words before the signal dropped: Sterling. Location. He pressed harder on the accelerator. Not dramatically. Just enough to close the remaining distance faster than a casual observer would clock. Audrey said. "What was that?" he said. "Someone's looking for us," she said. "How close?" he said. "Close enough to be on county comms," she said. "Then we need to be at the station before they find us," he said. "Yes," she said. "Then drive faster." He drove faster. They pulled into the Cascade District Station at 3:11 p.m. Cal Briggs was standing outside the main building with a coffee mug and the expression of a man who had been waiting, which told Cole that Reed had already found a way to make contact. Briggs was in his late 50s, lean, weathered. He'd run the Mountain District for 11 years and had developed the kind of unhurried authority that didn't need to announce itself. He looked at Cole, looked at Audrey, looked at the county maintenance truck with the expression of a man cataloging information before he commented on any of it. He said, "You borrowed one of my maintenance vehicles," Cole said. "It's in good condition," Briggs said. "Come inside." Inside the station, Briggs had a secure radio system, a body camera on his desk running a continuous timestamp, and a satellite uplink running through state law enforcement infrastructure rather than any commercial network. He also had a coffee machine that produced something barely qualifiable as coffee. Audrey drank 2 cups without commenting on the quality. Cole sat at the table with his notepad and began organizing the documentation sequence. What they had, what they needed, what order it needed to be presented in for it to be useful rather than just accurate. Because accurate and useful were not the same thing. An accurate picture presented in the wrong order was just a pile of facts. A coherent sequence was a story. And what they needed to give June Hartwell was not a pile of facts. It was a story a board of directors could follow in the 90 seconds before Warren Sterling had time to reframe it. His phone rang. Reed said, "Transmitting now. Everything. Renix Bay access log, the convoy radio compression data, the personnel reassignment order, the camera footage from the backup archive, a pause, and the wire transfer records. 3 payments. Oregon consulting firm. 2-layer registration, fund vehicle." Warren Sterling's personal holding structure. Cole looked at Audrey. She was already reaching for Briggs's satellite uplink. Reed said, "There's one more thing," Cole said. "Tell me," Reed said. "The consulting firm." I pulled the full corporate registration. The firm's signatory is not Warren directly, it's his chief of staff. "The same man who was at the estate 5 weeks ago for the Sunday dinner," Cole said. "The same man who had Audrey's phone for 4 minutes," Reed said. "The same man." Cole set the phone on the table. He looked at Audrey. She said, "June." Now Briggs was already on the satellite uplink. June Hartwell came on the line 4 minutes later. Cole had to twice at a distance. A compact, precise woman in her early 60s who moved through Audrey's world with the ease of someone who had been there long enough to understand exactly how it worked and was not impressed by any of it. Audrey spent 12 minutes on the line. She didn't summarize. She detailed date, time, event, evidence type, chain of custody. The kind of precision that June, on the other end, was clearly absorbing, because Cole could hear the sound of keys, of someone building something in real time from the materials being handed to her. When Audrey finished, June said, "The board meeting." Audrey said, "What about it?" June said, "It's been moved 12 hours earlier. Notice went out at 3:42 this morning." The room went quiet 3:42 in the morning. While they had been in the checkpoint with a generator for light and 4 pages of notes on a borrowed notepad, Warren had advanced the timeline, which meant he already knew the original 48 hours wasn't going to hold, which meant someone in his network had communicated that the situation was more complicated than planned. The window they had was not 48 hours. It was whatever remained between now and whenever Warren could get a quorum in a room. Audrey looked at the clock on the station wall. She looked at Cole. She said, "How long to the city?" He said, "Hour 40 in the truck. Less in something faster." Briggs said from the corner, not looking up from his radio, "I have a department SUV with a full tank." Audrey said, "June, what do we need to walk into that room?" June said, "What you've already told me. Reed's documentation. And someone who can confirm the chain of custody on the tracking device and the phone application." Audrey said, "We have all of that." June said, "Then get here." They were in Briggs's department SUV, Briggs driving, Cole in the passenger seat. Audrey in the back with her notepad and a county-issued tablet that June had arranged remote access to. When the first news alert came through, Cole read it on the tablet: Sterling Meridian CEO missing. Driver suspected of abduction. Special operations background flagged by security team. Board to convene emergency session. He read it twice, then he turned the tablet so Audrey could see it. She read it once. She said, "Warren's controlling the clock and the narrative at the same time." Cole said, "Yes," she said, "if I'm not in that room before quorum is declared." He said, "I know," she said. "Then we don't have an hour 40. He said, "Briggs." Briggs said, "I heard her." He turned on the lights. Not the siren, the lights. The kind of signal that tells traffic you are coming through without announcing to everyone in a 2-mile radius exactly where you are and how fast. Cole looked at the alert one more time. Driver suspected of abduction. Special operations background flagged. He thought about the document that had been found in the abandoned SUV. His name, $1 million, unsigned. The document had been built to destroy him if things went sideways. A fabricated paper trail. Rennick's insurance against a situation that hadn't gone according to plan. If Cole had been found alone, if Audrey had never made it to safety, the document would have told a very clean story, except the document existed. And it had Rennick's signature on the guarantee line, and Warren Sterling had not known Rennick was building his own exit, which meant there was a crack in everything Warren had constructed. A crack that June could widen. A crack that had been created not by anything Cole had done, but by the oldest and most reliable flaw in any plan that uses people as instruments. People who are used as instruments eventually start acting in their own interest. Cole turned back to the road ahead. The city lights were beginning to show on the horizon. Seattle in the early evening, lit against the cloud base, spreading across the hills and the waterfront and the bridge approaches. He thought about the morning of the interview, the parking lot of his apartment building, the charcoal suit, the printed application on the kitchen table with Sloane's handwriting in the margin. "Dad, just go." He thought about the tire, 17 pounds per square inch below threshold. He thought about what it meant to say the car was not safe to move and mean it, and refused to move it until the problem was fixed. He thought about Sloane's voice on the phone when she said she was proud of him. The way she held it out to him like something she believed he needed. He would call her when this was done, not before, when it was done. The road stretched ahead of them through the darkening hills. Briggs drove with the steady authority of a man who knew every curve of this county highway and had no intention of letting any of them be a surprise. And Cole watched the city come closer, 1 mile at a time. The news alert was still on the tablet when Audrey recorded her statement. She didn't look at it again. She sat in Cal Briggs's office chair, in Cal Briggs's Mountain District station, under fluorescent light that made everything look slightly more serious than it already was. And she looked directly at the tablet camera and she spoke. No notes, no script, just the facts in the order they happened. Cole stood outside the office doorway and listened, not because he needed to hear it, because he needed to know what it sounded like from the outside, whether it carried the weight of what it was, not a defense, not a plea, an accounting. A woman reporting the facts of her own situation with the same precision she brought to a quarterly earnings presentation. She said she was safe. She was in direct communication with law enforcement. She had left the convoy voluntarily because the convoy had been compromised from the inside. The responsible party had been identified. She was fully capable of leading Sterling Meridian Group through a board meeting that afternoon or any afternoon she chose. Then she itemized the tracking device installed beneath her vehicle's rear axle housing. The monitoring application embedded in her personal phone, authenticated through a certificate from her own security team's infrastructure. The convoy's radio frequency compression. The route change authorized by Wade Rennick at the 40-minute mark before departure, overriding the plan proposed by Reed Calloway. The personnel reassignment order that had pulled 3 protection team members from the original convoy formation before wheels ever left the motor court. She said, any board action taken in her absence without verified authorization from her directly was subject to immediate legal challenge. Then she stopped. She didn't add anything, didn't soften the edge of it, didn't perform resolution where resolution hadn't arrived yet. Briggs transmitted the video through the state law enforcement satellite channel to June Hartwell's office. along with the compressed documentation file. Reed's 4 weeks of logged observations, the wire transfer records, the chain of custody on the tracking device and the phone application, documented from the moment Cole had found each one to the moment Briggs had logged them into the station's evidence system 40 minutes ago. June called back in 11 minutes. She said, "I've got the legal framework, and I've found something." Audrey said, "Tell me." June said the board meeting was advanced to this morning. Notice went to all members at 3:42 a.m., but one of them called me at 4:09. Audrey said, "Who?" June said, "Elliot Marsh." Silence. Elliot Marsh had been on the Sterling Meridian board for 17 years. He had voted with Warren on 3 consecutive proxy measures over the past 6 weeks. He was, by any reasonable assessment, a committed member of Warren's coalition. Audrey said, "What did he say?" June said, "He said he couldn't do it. He said he watched the 4 a.m. news alert calling you unstable, and he has been in this industry for 30 years, and he knows what a stable CEO looks like and what a manufactured crisis looks like. And he is not willing to put his name on the latter." Pause. She said, "He also has a recording." Audrey said, "Of what?" June said, "The call Warren made to him at 3:38 a.m., 4 minutes before the formal notice went out. Warren told him the vote needed to happen before you could reappear. Because once you were back in the building, the window closed." Cole heard Audrey exhale, just once. A single breath released after being held for a very long time. She said, "That's enough," June said. "That's more than enough. Get here." Cole looked at Briggs. Briggs was already moving toward the SUV. Reed was waiting 8 blocks from the Sterling Meridian Tower. He was standing beside his car with a document portfolio under his arm, and the expression of a man who had slept approximately 90 minutes in the past 36 hours and was running on the specific fuel of professional obligation, crossed with personal accountability. Cole recognized that combination. He had run on it before. In conditions that made the last 24 hours look straightforward, Briggs pulled the department SUV to the curb. Cole got out first. Reed looked at him. The morning light was thin and overcast, the kind of light that removed shadow and made everything visible in a way that had nothing to do with comfort. Reed said, "I owe you an apology," Cole said. "You don't need," Reed said. "I do. Let me say it." Cole waited. Reed said, "I let you walk into the first 3 weeks without information you needed. I told myself I was protecting the investigation. But I was also protecting myself from having to explain why I hadn't moved faster when I first found the anomaly in the bay log." Cole looked at him. He said, "Did you have enough to move faster?" Reed said, "No." Cole said, "Then you made the call you had available to you," Reed said. "It nearly cost her," Cole said. "Nearly isn't the same as did. You do the next thing right. That's how you move forward from a decision you can't take back." Reed was quiet for a moment. Then he held out the portfolio. He said, "Everything. Renix Bay access log with timestamps. The camera footage from the 12-minute window pulled from the legacy backup archive. The personnel reassignment order. The radio compression data. The wire transfers. And Renix authorization record showing a secondary access credential he obtained 4 weeks ago that wasn't logged in the current system because he created it through a guest terminal he'd claimed was being used for a vendor compliance check." Cole opened the portfolio, looked at the top sheet, at the structure of the documentation, the way it was sequenced and cross-referenced. He said, "This is thorough work," Reed said. "It took 4 weeks." Cole said, "Good work takes what it takes." Audrey stepped out of the SUV. Reed looked at her directly. He said, "I'm sorry, Miss Sterling," she said. "Are the documents complete?" He said, "Yes," she said. "Then we're moving." She was already walking toward June's position 8 blocks north when Cole fell into step beside her. Briggs had arranged 2 Cascade County deputies in civilian clothes, plain vehicles, the legal authority to manage lobby access without the visual signature of a uniformed police presence. They were already in position at the building's main entrance. The city moved around them the way cities move, indifferent, continuous. Entirely unaware that the woman walking north on this particular sidewalk had spent the night in a cinder block room with a generator for light and a borrowed notepad, and had emerged from it with a cleaner picture of the past 6 weeks than most people could construct about their own lives. Cole walked at her left shoulder 1 step behind, the same distance he'd maintained for 3 weeks across every curb approach and lobby exit and motor court departure. Some things didn't require adjustment. They had the argument standing on the sidewalk 6 blocks from the tower. It lasted 4 minutes. Cole said he wanted to use the logistics access corridor, ground level, the building's lower eastern entrance. It connected through the service level to the elevator bank on the north side. You could reach the 42nd floor without passing through the main lobby, without being photographed at the entrance, without giving anyone positioned at the front of the building a visual on their arrival before they were ready. Audrey listened to all of it. Then she said, "No," Cole said. "The lobby is exposed." "We don't know who Warren has," she said. "I know what the lobby is," he said. "Then you understand the risk of," she said. "I understand that I am the CEO of this company, that I have walked through that front door 5 days a week for 14 years, that every person in that building and on that board and watching that news alert this morning is waiting to see whether I arrive through the front door or whether I arrive at all." She stopped walking, turned to face him. "If I come in through a service corridor, if I arrive in my own building the way someone arrives when they're hiding, I have already lost the room before I open the door." Cole looked at her. She said, "Warren doesn't need evidence. He needs the story. And the story of a CEO who entered through the basement is the only story he needs to make the instability question feel real." "Silence," Cole said. Briggs said, from 2 steps behind, already done, 2 deputies, civilian clothes, already inside the lobby. The legal authority to manage who entered and when, without anything that looked like a police action to anyone watching from the street. Cole looked at the building ahead. 42 floors of glass and steel, catching what little the October morning was offering. The Sterling Meridian logo in brushed steel above the revolving doors. The marble lobby beyond the glass, he said. "We go through the front," she said. "Yes," he said. "Stay with me until we're in the elevator," she said. "I know how to walk into a building, Cole," he said. "I know you do." They walked the remaining 6 blocks, and Audrey Sterling did not slow down once. The lobby was exactly what it always was, marble steel. The low, climate-controlled hum of a building designed to communicate permanence. Security desk at the center, 4 revolving door sections. The 2 deputies were positioned near the desk and near the far entrance, doing nothing that looked like anything other than waiting. 7 people turned to look when Audrey walked through the front door, not because she announced herself, because she didn't have to. She acknowledged the security guard at the desk by name. She crossed the marble floor toward the elevator bank with the document portfolio under her arm, and the particular forward momentum of a person who has decided that the direction they are moving is the correct direction and has nothing further to negotiate about it. Cole was 1 step behind, and to her left, Reed was behind Cole. June was already on the 42nd floor, having come up 40 minutes earlier through a separate entrance with the documentation package and a legal framework she'd been building since 4:09 in the morning when Elliot Marsh had called her. At the elevator bank, Audrey pressed 42. The elevator came. They rode up in silence. Cole watched the numbers climb. He thought about the morning of the interview, the 6 candidates in the foyer with their tailored lapels and their practiced calm. The tire at 17 pounds below threshold. The specific feeling of knowing something was wrong and saying so plainly. Not because it was impressive, because it was necessary, because the car did not move until the problem was fixed, and that was simply how things worked. He thought about Sloane, the printed application on the table, her handwriting in the margin. "Dad, just go." He thought about what she'd said when she called him from the student center with the careful voice of a person trying not to sound frightened. He thought about the 40 seconds he'd listened to her talk about a study group just to hear that she was all right. Just to carry the sound of her voice into whatever came next. He would call her when this was done. The elevator stopped. The doors opened. Cole could hear Warren's voice before they reached the conference room. Measured, carrying the practiced weight of a man who had spent decades in rooms where authority was performed rather than held. The voice of someone who had been rehearsing this particular posture for a very long time. Audrey didn't pause at the doors. She opened them and walked in. Warren Sterling was standing at the head of the conference table. 12 people seated around it. June Hartwell was at the far end near the window, with 2 stacked document folders in front of her. The room had arranged itself around Warren the way rooms arrange themselves around the person who has decided they are in charge. Documents at his position, attention oriented toward him, and then Audrey walked in, and the room shifted not dramatically. No one stood. No one said anything for the first 3 seconds. But the attention, the way 12 people were holding themselves in relation to the center of the room, moved. The way iron filings move when a magnet changes position. Warren said Audrey. She said Warren. She used his given name, not his title. Not the family honorific she'd used for 30 years. Just his name. The name that predated every role he'd accumulated. And in using it that way, without heat, without performance, she made clear that she was not walking into the room he had constructed. She was walking into hers. She set the document portfolio on the table. She sat in her chair. She said, "Should we begin? Or would you like a few minutes to review what I've brought?" Warren said, "Perhaps a brief recess would be appropriate, given the circumstances," she said. "I'm fine, thank you." She opened the portfolio. She presented it the way she presented everything that mattered, without theater, without the performance of grievance, without giving Warren the gift of a reaction he could use. She presented the tracking device, its installation window, the 12-minute camera blackout, the access log showing the only credential with remote override capability during that window. She placed the photograph Cole had taken on the first night on the table and let it sit there. She presented the monitoring application, the certificate timestamp, the authentication trail leading back to estate security infrastructure. The 5-week gap between installation and the arrival of the person most people in the room had assumed was responsible. And the specific reason that person could not have been responsible, because senior administrative credentials had not yet been provisioned to him at that date. She presented Reed's documentation, the convoy radio compression data, the route change Rennick had authorized at the 40-minute mark, overriding the original plan Reed had filed in the convoy briefing, the personnel reassignment order carrying Reed's cloned credentials, the camera footage from the legacy backup archive showing the 12-minute window in the vehicle bay. She presented the wire transfers, 3 payments, the Oregon consulting firm, the 2-layer corporate registration trace, the fund vehicle, the connection to Warren Sterling's personal holding structure through his chief of staff's signatory role. She presented the recording, Warren's voice at 3:38 a.m. Calm and deliberate, telling Elliot Marsh that the vote needed to happen before Audrey could reappear. Because once she was back in the building, the window closed. The room was very quiet when the recording ended, the kind of quiet that isn't absence of sound, but presence of something that everyone in the room is processing at the same time, and no one is ready to name yet. Warren said, "This material has been assembled under duress, by a man with a sealed military record who," Audrey said, "the chain of custody on every item in this portfolio is documented and time-stamped." The tracking device was logged by Sheriff Cal Briggs of the Cascade Mountain District at 3:18 yesterday afternoon. The phone application was confirmed by a state law enforcement diagnostic run at the same location. The wire transfer records were obtained through Reed Calloway's independent investigation, which I am prepared to have audited by any forensic accounting firm this board chooses to appoint. She didn't raise her voice. Not once. Warren tried again. He said that a man with an undisclosed special operations background had maneuvered their CEO into a vulnerable position, and that the board had a fiduciary obligation to. Audrey said Cole Hart listed prior military service on his application. The full content of a sealed service record carries no civilian disclosure obligation. What he disclosed was accurate. What he did in the past 30 hours is fully documented. If any board member would like to examine that documentation item by item, I invite them to do so. June Hartwell slid 2 copies of a bound document packet to the members on either side of her without being asked. The packets moved down the table. Cole was in the hallway outside. He had given his statement to the Cascade County investigator, a composed woman named Lester, who wrote in a notebook rather than a device, which Cole found quietly reassuring. She asked her questions in sequence. He answered in sequence. He described the chain of events from the day he first noticed the gray sedan to the morning he'd checked the tire pressure before a convoy that was already compromised before it left the motor court. He did not describe his service record in any detail. He described the specific, documentable sequence of what he had observed, recorded, and reported. Every item with a timestamp, every item with a third-party confirmation or a physical artifact. The investigator asked about his military background. He said his service record was available through the appropriate federal channels. He said nothing in it was relevant to the preceding 30 hours, because he had not performed any act in that window that required special operations training. He had driven carefully, preserved evidence carefully, communicated carefully with law enforcement. She wrote that down. Then she said, "Mr. Hart, the document recovered from the abandoned SUV, your name on it. $1 million, Cole said. Yes, she said. Do you know why it exists? Cole said Rennick built it as insurance. If the situation went sideways, he needed a story that placed the liability somewhere other than himself. My name, an unsigned compensation figure, and a vague definition of services is a document that tells whatever story someone needs it to tell, she said. Except it has his guarantee signature on the endorsement line, Cole said. Except that, she said, which means he wasn't as protected as he thought he was. Cole said, people who use other people as instruments tend to find that out. Eventually, she wrote something down, looked at her notes, then looked at him. She said, one more question. The beacon. You activated it and then left it at the checkpoint. Was that a decision you made it in advance? Cole said. I made it in the moment, but it followed from something I'd been trained to understand for a long time. If someone is tracking a signal, give them a signal to track. Just not the one that leads to where you actually are, she said. And the decision to use the county maintenance truck instead of the estate vehicle, he said. The estate vehicle was registered in the estate's fleet system. The truck was registered to county infrastructure, 2 different networks. If someone is monitoring one, they're not necessarily monitoring the other, she said. You thought through those contingencies before the convoy departed, he said. I thought through them 3 days before the convoy departed. She looked at him for a moment longer than the question required. Then she thanked him for his time and moved down the hall. Cole stood in the corridor with his notepad. He went through the list the way he always went through lists after a situation concluded. What had worked? What had nearly not worked? What he would do differently? Not because the review changed anything that had already happened, because the review was how you carried the learning forward into the next time something asked more of you than your title suggested you should have. A door opened down the hall. He looked up. Wade Rennick was being escorted through the lobby exit by 2 of Briggs's deputies. He wasn't in restraints. He was walking with the controlled stillness of a man who had run out of moves and knew it. He passed the elevator bank without looking up. Then, at the corridor entrance, he stopped. He looked at Cole. Cole looked at him. There was nothing to say. The situation had said everything. Rennick had made his decision 6 weeks ago, or maybe earlier. At whatever moment Warren's intermediary had first made contact with the right number. And Cole had made his 3 weeks ago in a vehicle bay at 6 in the morning with a magnetic detection tool and a notepad. And the simple, unglamorous discipline of a man who checked things because checking things was what kept people safe. The decisions had arrived at the same place. One of them was being escorted out. The other was waiting in the hall. Rennick turned and kept walking. Cole turned back to his notepad. 40 minutes later, the door at the end of the corridor opened and the conference room began to empty. Bird members moving in 1s and 2s toward the elevators. June Hartwell speaking with 2 of them near the water station. Her voice low and continuous. The voice of someone delivering the second layer of information after the first layer has been absorbed. Warren Sterling came out with his attorney. A careful exit. No drama. The practiced departure of a man who had spent enough years in institutional settings to understand that how you leave a room can matter as much as what you did in it. He didn't look at Audrey on the way out. She didn't watch him go. The formal vote on Warren's suspension had carried. 9 in favor, 2 abstentions, 1 recusal. The Logistics Division acquisition was suspended pending a full investigation. A forensic audit of board communication records had been authorized. The Cascade County investigator had enough for formal charges against Rennick by the time the meeting adjourned. She'd told June so in the corridor at 2:09 p.m. June had relayed it to Audrey with the specific efficiency of someone who saves the delivery of good news until it can be delivered completely. A board member Cole didn't recognize, silver-haired and carrying the worn authority of someone who had been in corporate governance long enough to have seen most things, stopped near the elevator and said to Audrey, "The driver, I want to understand something. His background." The sealed record. Whether the board should be concerned about the nature of his involvement, Audrey looked at the man. She said, His background is more thoroughly documented at this moment than anyone else's in this building. If you'd like to raise the question formally, I'd suggest waiting until everyone present has fully verified their own record first. The man said nothing further. Cole was standing 12 feet away. He heard it. He kept his face still, but something shifted in his chest that he hadn't expected. Not pride exactly. Something quieter than that. The recognition of being seen accurately by someone who had no obligation to see you that way, and chose to anyway. Audrey came out of the conference room at 3:22 p.m. She stood next to him in the corridor. She didn't say anything immediately. She looked at the far end of the hall for a moment, at nothing in particular. Just the neutral space of a corridor after the thing that needed to happen had happened. Then she said, "Have you eaten anything in the past 22 hours?" He thought about it honestly. He said, "The sandwich." She said, "The sandwich." He said, "In the parking structure." Yesterday afternoon, she looked at him the way people look at other people when the information is technically comprehensible, but the behavior behind it is not. She said, "That's unconscionable," he said. "I was focused." She said, "You need food," he said. "I'm aware," she said. "There's a place on 5th. 3 blocks. They know me there," he said. "You don't have to." She said, "Cole?" He said, "Yeah," she said. "You drove me through a forest in a county maintenance truck and used a beacon as a decoy and memorized a drainage channel map at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night," he said. "That's accurate," she said. "The least I can do is buy you soup," he said. "The least," she said. "Don't push it," he almost smiled. They walked to the elevator together. The lobby was quieter now. The deputies had stood down. Briggs was on his phone near the security desk, wrapping up the coordination sequence with the county investigator's office. He caught Cole's eye as they passed and gave him one brief nod. The kind of nod that means it held together. The kind that costs nothing to give and means more than most sentences. Cole nodded back. They walked out through the front door into the October afternoon. The city was doing what cities do in the hour after a crisis resolves. Moving. Indifferent. Continuous. A bus went past on 5th Avenue. A group of people with coffee cups moved around them on the sidewalk. The ordinary noise of a place that had no idea what had just occurred 42 floors above it. And for the first time in 36 hours, Cole Hart was not building a plan. He was just walking 3 blocks to a restaurant on 5th, that was all. And it was, in the way of things that seem small after larger things, exactly enough. The place on 5th was quiet at 3:45 in the afternoon. The kind of restaurant that exists in the gap between lunch service and dinner. Half the tables cleared. The remaining staff doing side work. The light coming through the front windows at an angle that made everything look warmer than the October day actually was. They ate. First they sat, and the server brought water. And they looked at the menus in the silence of 2 people who have been through something together and are discovering that the space on the other side of it is unfamiliar and quieter than either of them expected. Cole ordered soup and a sandwich. Audrey ordered the same. He raised an eyebrow. "It sounded good," he said. "It's practical," she said. "Practical is underrated," he said. "You're the CEO of a major corporation," she said. "I'm aware of that," he said. "You can order whatever you want," she said. "I want the soup and the sandwich, Cole. Let me have the soup and the sandwich." He let her have the soup and the sandwich. The food came. They ate. The server refilled the water once without being asked. The light through the front window shifted slightly as the cloud cover moved, and then Audrey said, "I'm going to offer you the director position." Cole set his spoon down. She said, "And you're going to decline," he said. "Yes," she said. "Tell me why." Not the short version. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "When my wife received her first diagnosis, I was at sea. Deployment. I didn't know for 4 days because the communication window was what it was, and that was the nature of the job." He paused. "When she received the second one, I was in a briefing room in Virginia. I found out 3 hours later. I drove to the airport and I was there by midnight." Another pause. "I was there for the third. I arranged to be. And I am grateful for that every day, in a way I don't have clean language for," she said. "But," he said, "but the first 2 happened, and nothing that came after changed that they had happened." She said nothing. He said, "I spent 14 years being the most prepared person in every room I walked into. Trained for contingencies that most people don't know exist. And I was good at it. I was genuinely good at it." He looked at his hands on the table. "And I was not in my wife's hospital room when the doctor gave her the news the first time." Because I was somewhere else being good at something else, Audrey said. That's not a simple equation, he said. No. The mission mattered. The people I served with needed what I brought. I'm not saying the choices were wrong. I'm saying the choices had a cost. And the cost was real. And the person who paid most of it wasn't me, she was very still across from him. He said, the director position is the same structure, different uniform, permanent deployment, different address. And I know what that costs because I've already paid it in the currency that mattered most. I don't want to spend the rest of my life in a role that asks me to keep paying it. Outside, a bus went past on Fifth Avenue. The sound of it filled the space between them for a moment and then faded. She said, "What do you want?" He said. "To drive. To do work I'm good at on terms I can live with. To be home when Sloan calls. To finish paying the debt and rebuild the engine on an old car and get enough sleep that I stop knowing exactly what time it is without looking at a clock," she said. "That's a specific list," he said. "I have a specific mind," she said. "I've noticed that," he said. "The director position is the same category of thing I've been moving away from for 3 years. I'm not criticizing the role. I'm saying I know what it costs, and I've already made that payment." She looked at him across the table. At the man who had found the tracking device at 10 o'clock at night and told her about it because she deserved to hold the information. Who had driven a county maintenance truck through the Cascade foothills and used a beacon as a decoy and memorized a drainage channel map because preparation was not the same as paranoia. Who had stood outside a conference room while she presented his actions to a board of directors and had not been in the room to hear what she said about him. She said, "What if the role were different?" He said, "Different how?" She said, "Transportation security advisory, part-time, route assessment and protocol review for the executive team. A schedule you control with my final approval on framework recommendations. No around-the-clock obligation, no emergency deployment. You consult on the architecture. You don't live inside it," he said. "That's significantly different from what you were offering," she said. "I revised," he said. "In the last 4 minutes," she said. "I revise when the situation warrants it." He looked at her. She looked at him. He said 6 months. "Trial basis." She said, "Done." He said, "That was fast." She said, "The terms are reasonable." When terms are reasonable, decisions are fast. He picked up his spoon again. She did the same. The server came by and asked if they needed anything else. Audrey said, "No thank you." Cole asked for the check. The server nodded and moved away, and for a few minutes they simply ate. The soup was good. The sandwich was good. The light through the window was doing something worth looking at with the low October angle it had found between the buildings. Cole thought, this is what a day looks like after the other kind of day. This is what the ordinary side of things looks like when you've been far enough from it to see it clearly. It looked like soup and a window, and a woman across the table who had just revised an offer in 4 minutes because the terms made sense. It looked like enough. 6 months later, the news cycle had long since moved on. Warren Sterling had been removed from the board by a shareholder vote that carried by a margin large enough to leave no room for interpretation. Wade Rennick had accepted a plea arrangement that included full cooperation with the ongoing investigation. Decker had done the same, separately and with considerably less composure. Warren's chief of staff had been charged with computer fraud and unlawful surveillance for the installation of the monitoring application. The charges had been filed on a Tuesday and reported briefly, and then the news moved on because news always moved on. Reed Calloway had spent 3 months rebuilding Sterling Meridian's security infrastructure from the access protocols out. New communication architecture. A separation between personal protection and corporate communication systems that closed the specific vectors Rennick had used. It was good work. The kind that didn't announce itself. The kind that you only noticed if you knew what had been there before. June Hartwell had filed a voluntary transparency disclosure on behalf of Sterling Meridian. Board structure, equity distribution, executive authorization protocols. The skeptics had predicted it would damage the company's standing. It hadn't. And Cole Hart worked 3 days a week. He had a small office near the waterfront that he shared with a retired maritime insurance investigator named Bowman, who drank terrible coffee and kept 3 cats that were technically not permitted in the building, and who had never, in 6 months of working in adjacent spaces, asked Cole a single question about his military service. Cole respected this more than he could easily explain. He had paid off the last of the medical debt in February. He'd sent the confirmation to Sloane as a screenshot with no caption. She had sent back a voice memo of herself making a sound he could only describe as uncontained relief. He'd listened to it 3 times standing in his kitchen with his wife's grocery list still on the refrigerator. Still there, still company. He had gone to Seattle in April to watch Sloane present her end-of-year engineering project, structural analysis of load distribution in cable-stayed bridges. She stood at the front of the room and explained load vectors to a panel of 3 professors and 2 industry guests with the calm certainty of someone who knew the material and had decided that knowing it was sufficient reason to be unafraid. Afterward, she'd said, "Did you understand any of that?" He'd said, "About 40%. She'd said, "That's genuinely impressive for someone outside the field." He'd said, "Thank you." She'd said, "I'm proud of you, Dad." He'd said, "I know." She'd made a face. He'd said, "I'm proud of you too." Obviously, she'd said. Obviously, she was flying out the following week for a summer research position at a structural engineering firm in Portland. She'd been offered it in March and had called him immediately, not to ask whether she should take it, to tell him she was taking it and to describe the project parameters in detail because she knew he would want the specifics. He'd listened to all of it. He drove her to the airport on a Wednesday morning. She had 2 bags, one enormous, one small. He put both in the trunk of the rebuilt sedan without comment on the disproportion. She said, "I'm not overpacking," he said. "I didn't say anything," she said. "You made the face," he said. "I don't have a face," she said. "You have a very specific face." He said goodbye in the way of people who are not constructed for goodbyes, briefly, with a hug that lasted longer than either of them would acknowledge if asked. She said, "Call me when you have a spare hour," he said. "I always call," she said. "I know. That's why I said it." She went through the doors. He watched until she cleared security. Then he got back in the car. The rebuilt engine turned over with the smooth authority of something that had been taken apart and put back together by someone who understood which parts mattered and why. His wife had bought this car in the first year of their marriage. He had nearly sold it twice in the 3 years since she died. He hadn't. He'd rebuilt the engine instead. Sourced the interior trim from a salvage yard in Tacoma. Spent 2 weekends fitting it by hand in the parking lot of his apartment building. While the neighbors walked past and asked questions, he answered in the fewest words possible. The car ran the way it was supposed to run. That was its own form of testimony. On a Friday in April, his phone rang, not the Sterling Meridian System line, not the consulting arrangements administrative contact, her direct number. The one she'd given him 6 months ago with the instruction that it was for direct contact and not for routing through any scheduling system. She said, "Are you working today?" he said. "I have a protocol review at 2. She said, "Morning." He said, "Free." She said, "I need to get to the house on the Sound. Not for a meeting, not for anything with an agenda. The calendar is empty and I'd like to go there and I'd like not to drive myself." He said, "I'll be there at 9. He was there at 8:55. The rebuilt sedan was parked in front of the estate's main entrance when she came out. She was wearing a coat he hadn't seen before, dark green. She was carrying nothing, no document case, no phone in her hand, no tablet. Just herself and the coat and the expression of a person who has given themselves permission to have a morning with nothing attached to it. She stopped at the car. She looked at it the way she'd looked at the maintenance survey document 4 pages into Audrey's notepad in the checkpoint room. With attention, with the recognition that the thing in front of her had been put together by someone who knew what they were doing. She said, "This is a very well-maintained old car," he said. "Thank you," she said. "I mean that as a genuine compliment," he said. "I know you do," she said. "Do you know what my car cost?" he said. "I know exactly what your car cost." She said, "Does that bother you?" he said. "Not even slightly," she said. "Good." She opened the passenger door. He said, "Clients generally sit in the back." She sat down in the front. She said, "This isn't a client arrangement." He looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he started the engine. They drove north along the coast road, slower than efficiency required, the kind of pace that exists in the gap between destination and the traveling itself. Where the traveling is the point, the water appeared on the left side after the first ridge. Puget Sound, wide and gray-blue and holding the morning light in the way open water does, differently than land does. With the quality that makes you understand why people have always built their lives near it. She said, "Tell me about Sloane," so he told her. The presentation, the load vectors he'd understood at 40%, the two bags with their pronounced size difference. The face she'd made when he said he didn't have a face. Audrey laughed, not the professional acknowledgement of something amusing, the involuntary kind. The sound that belongs to the actual person, rather than the version of the person who chairs board meetings and delivers quarterly statements. He had heard it once before, in a cinder block room with generator light and a folding table, when he'd said he wanted his paycheck to arrive on time and his schedule to make reasonable sense. It sounded the same now, like something that hadn't been planned. She said, "She sounds extraordinary," he said. "She is. She got that from her mother," Audrey said. "Did she get anything from you?" He said. "The face, apparently." She laughed again. He drove the road curved along the headland and the view opened across the water. The Olympics in the far distance, holding snow at the peaks. A ferry making its crossing from the western terminal, small against the scale of the sound. The light going slightly warmer as the morning moved into itself. She said, "I believed for a long time that your sealed record was the remarkable thing. The training, the capability. What I needed on that road when there was nowhere to go." He said nothing. He knew she wasn't finished. She said, "I understand now that the more remarkable thing is something else entirely. You had all of that capability, all of it. And you never once used it to make me feel smaller than I was," he said. "That's not what capability is for," she said. "Most people use whatever they have," he said. "The training is for bringing people home. That's what it's always been for. Everything else is just noise around that." She looked at him. She said, "Have you brought yourself home yet?" He looked at the road ahead. At the water on the left, at the direction that pointed neither toward a mission nor away from something, but simply forward into the morning. He thought about the rebuilt engine. The last payment. Sloane's voice on the phone. The small office near the waterfront. The grocery list on the refrigerator that still had his wife's handwriting on it, which he had decided, somewhere in the past 6 months, was not something to move. It was just her handwriting, still there. And that was all it needed to be. He said, getting closer. She said, "Is there anything I can do?" He said. "You already did it," she said. "When?" He said. "When you hired someone to drive your car because he was the only one who said the tire wasn't safe." She looked at the water. She said, "That was a hiring decision," he said. "Was it?" Long pause. She said, "I'm beginning to think it was more than that," he said. "I've been thinking that for a while." She turned to look at him. He kept his eyes on the road. But the corner of his mouth moved, just slightly. The way it moved when something was true and he didn't have better language for it than that. She turned back to the water. And neither of them said anything else for a long time, because there wasn't anything else that needed to be said yet. There was just the road and the water and the October morning, doing what October mornings do on the coast of the Pacific Northwest, when the clouds are high and the light comes through at the right angle. The road curved again. The headland fell away. The sound spread out ahead of them, wide and silver and calm, the way it gets when the wind hasn't arrived yet and the water is still and the light is treating it like something worth keeping. He slowed the car, not to stop, just to let the view exist at the right pace for what it was. She said, "Thank you," he said. "For what?" She said. "For not leaving when you could have." He looked at the road for a moment, at the water. At the place where the sky met the sound and the line between them was clear and unhurried and real. He said, "There was never anywhere else I needed to be." She held that he could feel her holding it. "The way you feel the weight of something settling into its right place." She said, "That's the truest thing you've said to me," he said. "I've been working up to it," she said. "Only took 36 hours and 6 months," he said. "I move at my own pace," she said. "I've noticed." He started driving again, slower than before, both of them watching the water and the light and the distance between where they were and wherever they were going. A distance that had stopped feeling like something to be managed. The ferry was still crossing. The mountains held their snow. The road followed the coastline north, the way it had always followed it. Patient and certain and going exactly where it was supposed to go. And somewhere in the miles that followed, without either of them marking the moment it happened, the car became the kind of space that belongs to people who have decided they are not in a hurry. Because the road ahead was not a problem to be solved, it was just the road, and it was enough.